All right, Isaiah 60, let's call this one the wealth of the nations in this chapter that talks about the way in which God is once again going to make his people a light to the nations as the nations are going to bring the wealth of the nations to Israel as he resettles them, possibly just after the dispersion, the one that's going to happen in the old covenant, but quite possibly pointing forward to the larger dispersion that lingers even after Israel is resettled. One quite possibly similar to what we see today, where Israel is still a nation, but large numbers of Jewish people are still spread around the globe. This passage may be pointing to a future time, even beyond where we are now, where God recalls his people home along with the foreigners who are willing to live with them in peace. But first things first, breaking the chapter down in a little more detail, verses 1 through 3. We'll talk about the way in which God is calling his people to arise and shine for. Verse 2, even though the world will be covered in darkness. Verse 3, he is going to make them, as we mentioned, a light to the nations, and kings shall come to the brightness of their rising. The next section running roughly from verses 4 through 14, where he will talk about the way in which their kids or their sons and daughters will return to them, like we said, presumably from the dispersion, maybe the dispersion, as we said, about to happen before the close of the old covenant, or quite possibly the lingering effects that we still see to this day. Either way, in addition to their sons and daughters returning to them in verse 5, the abundance of the seas will come to them along with the wealth of the nations, thus the title. With that, verse 6, camels laden with all kinds of goods, and also good news and praises, pointing forward to the third section of the chapter, talking about the way in which they will not simply have the wealth of the nations, but they will have a peaceful environment or peace of mind with which to enjoy all that God has given them. Understanding that they will likewise have flocks included in the abundance to which God is bringing them. Understanding that after verse 7, we'll see what seems to be, or at least what seems to me, a second section where he talks about the way in which not only will their children return from afar, but they're not coming back broke. They're coming back with silver and gold in verses 8 and 9. Third section seeming to run from verses 10 through 14. In that middle section, talking about the way in which they will appreciate a new relationship with foreigners, especially those who once kept them in captivity, saying the foreigners will build up their walls and their kings will minister to them, because even though he struck them in his wrath, he is now building up his people in favor. Understanding that verse 11 says that their gates will be open continually, not necessarily for hospitality alone, but so that, once again, the wealth of the nations, thus the title, will always be able to come in 24/7. Understanding that verse 12 is going to say that the nation or kingdom that will not serve them will perish. Verse 13 talking about the way in which God is doing this to beautify the place of his sanctuary. Understanding that twice in this section, he's going to talk about the purpose for a lot of this being to beautify the sanctuary. That being, as we mentioned, in verse 13, likewise in verse 7. But a third time in verse 9, it's going to say, because he is going to beautify his people, or because he has made his people beautiful. Verse 14, however, in that second set of verses, the ones talking about the wealth of the nation, will conclude by talking about the way in which the sons of those who afflicted you will now come bending low before you. Understanding the way in which that helps describe what we talked about before, another worst to first method of balancing things out that God sometimes uses. Likewise, it's going to seem to pick up that same worst to first theme in the third and final section of the chapter, running roughly from verses 15 through 22, a section also breaking down into three, smaller subsections, at least as I see it, where, once again, he'll pick up that worst to first theme, talking about the way in which, whereas you have been forsaken and hated, I will make you majestic forever, a joy from age to age. Verse 16, giving a purpose statement, or for that reason, you shall know that he is the Lord. But beyond the wealth and the beauty, it's the environment. As we might have suggested, but I don't know if I stated it specifically, the chapter seems to break down in 3 sections. As we mentioned, the one in which he is calling us to realize the way in which, once again, his people are to be a light to the nations. That light is what seems to be the catalyst for the nations drawing or being drawn back to his people with the wealth of the nations. And then finally, the environment in which they are all enjoying this newfound wealth is an environment of peace or peace of mind. As the latter half of verse 17 reads, I will make your overseers peace and your taskmasters righteousness. Also reminding me of what he said in verse 21, where it reads, your people shall all be righteous. Reminding us once again why it is so important to perfect the relationship we have with the God who is willing to protect us from our enemies and our inner me. An illustration I, from time to time, say I got from one of my favorite Jesus rappers. Understanding that the enemies God could protect me from really don't mean a whole lot if my inner me is still ruining the peace of my own environment. Chapter 60 quite possibly helping us see that point from this perspective, to the degree that we have had times in our lives when we have struggled with bad bosses. He is telling us that he is preparing for us a place in which he is replacing bad bosses with peace and righteousness. But he is likewise calling us to keep that same energy, because as it says in the new covenant, if you are faithful over a little, he will make you rulers over much. And so to the degree we understand the blessing of having good bosses, he's calling us to likewise be righteous bosses.